The passage we read this morning in Ezekiel, it's the same as a lot of passages in the Hebrew Testament, unfortunately. And that's where the prophets are just giving a really, really bad review of the leaders of Israel because they're not taking care of their people. In Israel at the time, the rich, they were getting richer, and the poor were getting poorer. And in this passage, the wealthy are described as fat. We call them fat cats today, I think. While the poor are described as lean. And the leaders of Israel, instead of leading the flock, instead of doing the job that God put them in the position to do, instead of feeding the flock, they fed themselves from the flock. They used the people for their own benefit without caring what happened to the people themselves. They were meant to be shepherds. God appointed these leaders as shepherds, and they were supposed to protect the people and make sure that they were fed and to make sure that they were cared for, but they did not live up to that job. And so God says that they will seek out their flock, the flock that was scattered. They'll rescue the ones that were wandering, lost, and alone in the wilderness. And when God finds them, they're going to feed them, and they're going to give them rest, and they're going to bind up the wounded, and they're going to strengthen the weak. God says that they're going to take over the leadership of the people. And the passage doesn't give details about how this is going to come to pass or how the leadership is going to be executed. It simply says that new leadership is needed and that God's going to do the job personally. They themselves. But even in this vision of a time when all is going to be fulfilled, when God personally takes charge of the people, there's still this tension in the separation of good and bad. It's going to be the strays and the wounded and the weak against the fat and the strong. The strong oppressors of the community, they treated the weak with injustice and contempt, and the weak had little hope until God intervened. But God promises that they will intervene, and that when they do, and they take over the leadership, the fat oppressors will be destroyed. Enter Jesus, God incarnate, that's going to personally take over the job of shepherding the people. Jesus takes this passage from Ezekiel and he makes a parable out of it. It was his favorite way to teach. And this parable makes use out of an everyday shepherding practice. When they had a herd that was full of goats and sheep alike, when nightfall came, they would separate the two. Because the sheep, they preferred to spend the night out in the open air. Whereas the goats, they liked the warmth of a shelter. And the story presumes, as was customary in the first century, that sheep are more valuable than goats. Now, why is that, do you think? Because sheep go where you tell them to go. Goats will break free in a heartbeat. And as my mom found out when I was a kid, they will make a beeline for the backyard and eat every last one of my dad's t-shirts off the line. Sheep don't do that. They will wander. Sheep will wander wherever they will, but they won't do it deliberately. They have no will of their own. Their only will is to stay where that shepherd is because they know the shepherd is going to take care of them. Goats go their own way, but whether sheep or goats, this parable reveals that God is truly righteous because it provides a criteria by which all people, sheep and goats, will be judged equitably. The obedient are the sheep, and they will be blessed. And the goats are disobedient, and they will be cursed. And the scene for God's rule, this paradise where all will be fulfilled, where all people will come together, this was prepared before the world was ever began. But it's the behavior and the attitude of the herd that's going to set their course. Now, in this parable, Jesus is the shepherd as well as the human one. And all through his book, Matthew, he's been pointing to a day of judgment for the church. Okay, when Matthew wrote this book, he wrote it for the brand new emerging church, the church that was made primarily of Jews that were still devout to their own practices, to their own religious customs. And the whole point behind all of these parables is that Matthew was saying that the church includes the entire human family, which up until now has been represented just in a few stories by wheat and weeds, by faithful servants and lazy servants, by good and bad fish, okay? It's not just the Jews, it's everyone, is what he's trying to get across. And the criteria for judgment, and it's judgment in this parable, but again, we can't take these parables literally. The criteria for being fully blessed. It was already known in the Jewish community, and it was to the Jewish community that Jesus preached. And that criteria was service. And by identifying himself with the least of these, the care of these people became applicable not only to Christians, but to the entire human family. Okay, it was a mere 2 days after Jesus tells the story that he is betrayed and handed over to the religious authorities. 2 days. And in that act of betrayal, Jesus becomes the epitome of the least of these. He becomes imprisoned. He becomes rejected. He becomes thirsty. He eventually is killed. He is the epitome of someone who needs a kind word, someone who needs clothing and shelter, and someone to take care of him at the hands of his oppressors, to rescue him from the hands of his oppressors. And because he knew his time was coming, okay, Jesus heard the clock ticking. He knew that the Pharisees had plans for him. He knew that this was coming. He was making this last attempt to drive home the point that it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. And it doesn't matter who your neighbors are or where they're from. The point of this life is to care for one another. It doesn't matter if you are a Christian or not. It doesn't matter if your neighbor is a Christian or not. This story doesn't insist that all persons have to become Christians to become a part of God's domain. It gives no indication that anyone is going to be excluded from God's dominion. The righteous are found everywhere, just as goats are to be found everywhere, even among people who proclaim themselves to be Christians. I don't know anyone like that, do y'all? Back in Jesus' time, the goats were the rulers and the religious authorities of the time. Just as in today's time, in this current world, the goats are the rulers and many of the religious authorities. Times haven't changed too much in 2,000 years. But back then, just as now, to be considered righteous is to serve the needy. And serving is to join in God's dissatisfaction of the current state of our world. It is to resist the powers that would profit from the poor and keep them in poverty. It's to embody God's will in the new age for all to be fed and housed and clothed and healthy and free. Jesus was then and is still now present with those who are suffering in this world. God shares in the community's sorrow, in their joy, and in their common life, and God will act to make that community situation right. And how does God act to make that community situation right? Through us, through those who have been given so much to be thankful for. The community that is obedient to God's will provides for the vulnerable, and is blessed because of it. The vulnerable suffer from hunger and thirst and being a stranger and illness. And while we're talking about the community of the least of these, this is a community where God Himself resides. They walk in the very presence of Almighty God. The world is who considers them less, not God. There is no purpose for people living in poverty. There is no purpose for people being viewed as being less than, except for this, is that as long as they are there, they serve the purpose for people who have plenty to help others. It is to instill empathy in God's followers to help those that are less fortunate. And while communities who act on God's behalf, they take care of their neighbors and they will be blessed. Okay, when Jesus, he says something at one point where those who have much, and I'm going to mess this up. It basically translates to, if you're given a lot, you're expected to give a lot. And when you give a lot, you're blessed. Because communities that allow hunger and homelessness and violence, they deny themselves the opportunity for that blessing. It's not that God withholds the blessing as some kind of punishment. It's that they are separating themselves from the love and will of God. They separate themselves from the blessing of God. And this isn't to say that good works alone can make your heart right with God. And I'm using some language that gives me a kickback to the evangelical church that I grew up in, but just bear with me. Good works alone are not enough, but faith alone is not enough either. What you will find is that if you are in service to your neighbor, the more you get into the work, the more you are on your hands and knees scrubbing, the more you are putting quarters in machines, the more you are taking food to the food pantry, the more you're digging up turnips, the more you are just putting yourself out there to serve your siblings, your brothers and sisters in this community, what you will find is that your heart will evolve. You've all seen The Grinch That Stole Christmas. His heart grew. That's what happens, guys. You get in there and you start doing the work and your heart begins to grow because you see these people and you see them in the current circumstances that they're living in, and you see that the situations that they come up against every single day, and all of a sudden, because you know them personally, their problems start to mean something to you. And you want to help them. You want to help them fix it. You want to help them eat, and you want to help them send their kids to school. We don't need to accomplish certain works in order to be welcomed into God's circle of love. God's love is for all, just as God's justice is for all. But at the same time, a community that acts in solidarity with the poor is the community that acts to do what God has called them to do. And such acts of mercy to others is an act of thanksgiving, is an act of thanks living and praise for the mercy that God has shown to us. Because every single thing that we have is a gift from God. We would have nothing if it wasn't for God's gifts, God's blessings, God's mercy. And it is by serving our neighbors that we're able to say thank you. This Sunday, it's known as Christ the King Sunday. It's the Sunday before Advent begins. And there's a lot of talk about the day of the Lord, which is mentioned some in the New Testament, is mentioned a lot in the Old Testament, but it is the day when God will come and put right the wrongs in this world. And it was always seen as a great day of judgment and retribution. But the day of the Lord, the day when Jesus will be king in some form, It's not going to be because God comes riding in on the clouds of glory and says, that's not what I meant, do it right. That's up to us. It is up to us to do that. It is up to us to right the wrongs of society. It is up to us to go to the polls and vote. It is up to us to feed our hungry neighbors. It is up to us to make sure that our school systems are in good working order so that the kids that go there, even if they do come from a poor home, have a fighting chance because they're getting the same education as the well-off kid sitting next to them. That is how we say thank you to God. And that is what God has called us to do. Amen.